Hello, EDU 304. This is Jared, and I want to welcome you to our very first Enneagram video lecture. Now, my goal for these lectures is to straddle between the times of 10 minutes to 15 minutes, but by nature of this being the very first video, I do want to give you this disclaimer up front that this one will probably run a little bit closer to 20 minutes. So be prepared for that. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to, before I really get into this, is just pull up the note sheet that I have available for you, and you're able to access this over on the right hand side where the handouts are listed, and it would just be the Enneagram note sheet for number 8, and you can go ahead and download this as a Word document and just go ahead and type in those boxes if you would like to. The other option for you, since you're not actually uploading these note sheets to my USF, is if you're more comfortable just typing out your own notes as we go along or writing them out by hand in a notebook, that's absolutely fine. The goal, though, is that you would take some notes, and what's helpful about the note sheet is this is sort of the template I move through in each one of these lectures. So these are the major points that I'm going to hit. And these are the points you're going to want to think about as you reflect on all 9 numbers in the Enneagram. The only assignment that will be required is a final Enneagram reflection at the end of the semester. So if you are taking notes by hand, please make sure that you're getting each of these points down for me. All right? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go back to our presentation here and remind you again that this is Enneagram number 8, and I'm going to follow a similar template through each one of these. But before we begin, let's go ahead and just remind ourselves of some of the information that I provided you with at the very beginning of our class. And I'm going to adjust the screen here just ever so slightly. I don't know if that's bothering you or not. When I initially proposed the Enneagram to you at the start of the class, I said that in this class, we view assessment as a method for discovering the truth of a person's understanding or knowledge. So assessment in the K-12 environment is a way for you as the instructor or the teacher to try to gauge the truth of your student's understanding or knowledge. And if we take that idea and we add the self component to it, then self-assessment ought to seek to discover the truth about ourselves, and that is something that the Enneagram does. As a reminder, the Enneagram is an ancient personality typing system that helps people to understand who they are and what makes them tick. And that's important. We're going to begin by telling you a little bit about the personality traits that manifest themselves in each number. But then what's more important is to discover why people who are number 8s or number 9s are behaving the way that they are. What's motivating their behavior? And then that helps us to determine if we are moving in a direction of health or of unhealth or stress or anxiety, so that we can sort of self-assess and regulate our behaviors and our emotions as we interact with other people. The purpose of the Enneagram, then, is to develop self-knowledge, so this is for you personally, and to learn how to recognize and disidentify with the parts of our personalities that limit us so we can be reunited with our truest and best selves. And I'll remind you once again that Enneagram is a Greek word that means it's a 9-sided figure. And so most often we see it in the form of this circle with 9 different spots. And I'll explain the arrows and how all those work a little bit later. What we're going to do is begin with number 8. And that might seem strange. Why wouldn't we begin with a number 1? But that will reveal itself in this lecture and then upcoming lectures as well. 8 is typically the best place to begin. So let's talk a little bit about type 8. And the label for type 8, it's often referred to as this type of person is a challenger, meaning that they are comfortable and even desire challenging other people. So every number exists on a spectrum. And as I'm going through these numbers, there are two questions you're probably going to naturally ask yourself. The first question is what Berg's describing, does that sound like me? In other words, am I a number 8? Is what Berg is describing in this lesson the way that I react and the way that I think and the way that I'm motivated? And you're either going to have a yes or a no to that, or maybe a sort of, kind of, sometimes. But the second question you're going to probably naturally ask yourself too is, who in my relational world does it sound like Berg is describing in this lecture? Because all of us have so many acquaintances, so many friends and relatives and coworkers and teachers, and we have such a wide social network that we're naturally going to try to pick apart and dissect all of our relational worlds. Now, I'm skeptical to have you do that. I don't want you to start moving forward and you go to the Easter get together, or you go to Thanksgiving break or something like that, and you begin telling everybody that they're a number 8 or they're a number 9 or so on and so forth. But I do think it is helpful to begin kind of thinking through who in your life or in your relational world is being described here. Because again, the purpose of this whole Enneagram business is that as teachers, we work in a highly social career. And so we are constantly interacting with a wide variety of different personalities. And as such, we need to know and understand what makes some of these personalities tick, how we might better be able to work together with these personalities, and so forth, in order to bring about the change in the education that we desire and envision for our students. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into number 8. And so what I usually begin with is sort of the spectrum of what does a healthy 8 look like? What does an average sort of in the middle 8 look like? And what does an unhealthy 8 look like? And I'm not talking necessarily physical health here. I'm talking more social, emotional, mental health. And so a number 8 that's in a healthy position would make a great friend. They'd be an exceptional leader. They'd be very diplomatic, meaning that they could work with people of various opinions and try to form consensus and really listen and work together to make sure all ideas are being heard. And most importantly, number 8s, I'm going to give you a lot of negatives about the numbers, but there are positives about each one of these numbers as well. Number 8s are champions for those people who are less fortunate, those people who are in need. How about an average 8? Well, instead of being as diplomatic as a healthy 8 might be, they're more steamrollers. And what I mean by that is that they're often not open or willing or receptive to hearing the ideas of others. They believe firmly in their mind and their decisions made up, and they're going to push those opinions upon other people. Sometimes their thinking is privy to the dualistic type of cognitive distortion, in that they view all things as either good or bad. Ideas are either good or bad. Situations are either good or bad. People are either good or bad. And so they suffer from this dichotomous black and white thinking. And what we recognize, especially in the field of education, is that most of life is a shade of gray. There are very few situations that are all good or all bad. There are very few villains that are all utterly and completely bad. Likewise, there are very few heroes that are utterly and completely good in every way. As we think about an unhealthy 8, oftentimes they're preoccupied with suspicion. They think that they'll be betrayed by other people, they might be slow to trust others, and even resort to revenge when they are wronged. And I want to pause before I get into this next section and just remind you that as we look at this spectrum, this Enneagram of 9 numbers, there is no number that is best. There's no hierarchy of one number is better than other numbers. As a matter of fact, a good team is a team that's represented by every number on the Enneagram. If I were a CEO of a business or an organization, my goal would be to try to find representation on my leadership team of all 9 numbers. My team would be chaos if every single member were a number 8. But likewise, we'd be a mess if every single number, a person were a number 2, and that they were all helpers and they all put other people's opinions and feelings ahead of their own. It'd be hard for us to get a lot done that way either. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we continue moving forward. Each number is typified by a quote-unquote deadly sin. And this is just a sin or a temptation that oftentimes that particular number is more prone to. And not always the case, but often with number 8s, their deadly sin is that of lust. And when we think about lust, most often, at least in my thinking, I think of lust in the sensual or sexual nature. And certainly lust can be that, but we can also lust after objects or other things. And for 8s, oftentimes it's more of a lust after intensity, after energy, after power. It's a lust for another title or another promotion. It's a desire to be in conflict, be engaged, not really take your foot off the gas. And that's the type of intensity that typifies 8s. They often have more energy than any other number on the Enneagram. And because of this, they ooze confidence. They can oftentimes be seen as overconfident or even cocky by people who are not number 8s. Just as all numbers have a dominant, I guess I should say, a sin, they also have a dominant emotion. And I think it's important to unpack these because sometimes when we hear the word lust or we hear anger, what we really mean in the Enneagram is different from what that word, the connotation of that word, the visual that we get in our brains when we hear it. So I say that anger is the dominant emotion of 8s, and what I mean by that is that their impulsive all or nothing approach to life manifests itself often in flashes of anger. But what those flashes of anger really show us are that they're defense maneuvers to avoid revealing weakness or vulnerability within the number 8. So we noted that oftentimes one of the positives of number 8s are that they stand up for those who are less fortunate. They want to represent the needs of the weak. But one of their greatest fears is that they themselves would be perceived as weak, that they would be out of control in some way. And because of this impulsivity in number 8s, it leads to an overindulgence in life. And that can manifest itself in a variety of contexts, either in that personality overworking, over partying, overeating, over exercising, and even overspending. And so that is something that whether you're a number 8 or you're in relationship with a number 8, you certainly want to be aware of and be on the lookout for. I note down at the bottom here that all of this passionate and combative energy oftentimes feels overwhelming and threatening to those of us who are not typified as number 8s. This is the natural way of life for a number 8, but it can be very intimidating to others surrounding the number 8. And as a number 8, you would want to know and recognize that. The talk style of a number 8 is characterized as commanding. If you can imagine sentences that are littered with imperatives or exclamation marks, these are directions, orders that the number 8 is giving to the troops. They believe that their viewpoints or their positions are correct, and they're often very hard to persuade to change their minds. For a number 8, it's kind of a strange puzzle that for others of us to solve who are not number 8s. But in a sense, conflict for a person who's a number 8 equals connection. And so when they're in conflict with another person, when they're debating or arguing with another person, they're actually within their own minds creating a connection with that person through the conflict. It's important for us to recognize that 8s, because they speak their mind, they view themselves as honest and straight-talking people. And so because that's the way that they view the world, that's their sort of the glasses through which they look at the world, they expect that everybody, of every other number on the Enneagram, would be just as honest and as straight-talking and as upfront and as argumentative as they are. But the reality is most of us are not wired that way. I'm going to reveal some characteristics of what childhood might look like for each number. And it's important for me to note that these are by nature stereotypical. And so they're not going to represent necessarily every 8. There's a piece of nature that's inherent in your personality, but there's also a part of nurture. And the reason that I relate these stories is that more often than not, an 8's childhood, they can point back to some similar type of situation that they feel like shaped them into the personality that they have today. And so oftentimes, for number 8s, there's some event, there's something that happened in their formative years that required them to abandon their childlike ways and to take on more responsibility, caring for their own lives or maybe the lives of others, brothers, sisters, maybe even parents. And the common theme is that this often happens prematurely in their lives at a point where they're not developmentally ready to take on that level of responsibility. I want to share a story with you that the authors give us in the book, The Road Back to You, because I think this illustrates what it might be like to be in relationship with a number 8. Again, if you are a number 8, or maybe you're not, but you recognize some of these characteristics we're discussing in the lives of those around you. And so it's important to recognize that for number 8s, information is power. 8s want to know all the facts. If they don't have the facts, they feel like they're not in power, they're not in control. And so the authors give us this story. There are 2 characters. There's Suzanne, who's the mother, and then Joey, who's the daughter. Let me go ahead and read from the book here for you. Joey, the daughter, was headed home from college when she was involved in a serious car accident that left her with a fractured shoulder, a dislocated hip, and nasty bruising. When Suzanne, the mother, saw Joey just before she went into surgery, she was shocked to see her looking so beat up. Every inch of her face was covered with pockmarks from rolling in the gravel. Fighting tears, Joey asked, "Mom, do I look horrible?" "Yes, sweetheart," said Suzanne. "You do." A gasp went up from the nurses nearby, the kind of gasp that Suzanne tells me women universally recognize as an intentional expression of judgment. The louder the gasp, the deeper the judgment. But Suzanne knew that 8s always want the truth, so she didn't paper it over. 8s don't want you to protect them from facts or coddle them by leaving out the unpleasant details. In an 8's mind, there's a lot at stake. If they don't know the truth, then they don't know what's really happening. And if they don't know what's really happening, then they're not in control. And not in control is where 8s never want to be. So in this relational example, Suzanne, the mother, recognizes that her daughter Joey is a number 8. And at a time as serious as this, she recognized that although it's not natural for most of us to speak the unvarnished truth, as a number 8, that's what Joey was expecting. That's the worldview, that's the lens, those are the glasses through which Joey's viewing the world. And so I think that story illustrates why this Enneagram can be so helpful to us moving forward into our professional careers as teachers. The reality is that we adjust the way that we speak and interact with our students and our colleagues and parents based on what we know about their personalities and their temperaments. We're not going to necessarily give every student an Enneagram test, but we are going to pick up on some of those subtle clues that give us an idea of where each student and where each colleague might land on this circle of the Enneagram. Finally, what's important to recognize about every number is that there is a secondary number that you will move to when you're feeling stress, in times of anxiety and chaos, when you're overwhelmed. That's an unhealthy direction. But there's also another number that you will gravitate towards in times of security, in times when you're feeling good, in times when life is going well. And that's what we call the security number. And so every number on the Enneagram has a stress number and a security number. And what's important about these is that within our own life, we can sort of use this as a gauge to say, hey, am I moving in an unhealthy direction or am I moving in a healthy direction? And we can also recognize when those around us are gravitating towards numbers that are maybe more typified by health or more signs of being in an unhealthy spot or position. So for number 8, in times of stress, they often gravitate towards 5s, which are investigators. These are by nature more introverted people. So this 8 becomes kind of more self-contained. Again, the number 5 is not a bad number, but it's bad when the 8 goes there in kind of a negative way. Because what that means is the 8 often withdraws and becomes even less connected to their emotions and or other people. They might experience health effects like insomnia, they might not be taking care of themselves, they become very secretive and self-obsessed with betrayal. But in times of security, 8s will move more towards the number 2, which are the helpers. And again, this doesn't mean that number 2s are always good. There are unhealthy ways for 2s to manifest themselves, and we'll talk about those at a later date. But what's important here is that when an 8 moves to a number 2, they're naturally in relationship with people. They begin to trust others. They allow others in to their thinking. They often reveal their weaknesses and allow others to take care of them. I also note down at the bottom here just a short list of celebrities and famous people who the book has identified as being characterized as number 8s. And I think sometimes that's just interesting for us to try to draw connections with. And then finally, I thank you for your patience here. My last slide today is just a list of some careers that we often find number 8s naturally gravitating towards based on their passions for pushing ideas, convincing other people, their lust for intensity, and their desire to stand up for the underdog. I'm going to go ahead and end this here. Again, I do apologize. This lesson ran a little bit longer than the others, but I do hope that it helped to kind of set the stage for what we'll be doing in the future. As a final reminder, you do not need to upload any sort of note sheet for this, but I do ask you to keep those notes compiled together in a safe place so that you're able to utilize those in another 6 or 8 weeks when you actually complete your Enneagram reflection.